Good morning, everybody. Hi, Biggs. Thought I would read some more chapters of this book. I got to get it back to the library one of these days, but I know you want to hear the end of it. So this is the Ulysses Moore, The Door to Time, Chapter 6, A Dive into the Sea. Outside, they ran into Nestor. That's the kids. Remember, they were exploring the house. The old caretaker eyed them suspiciously. Rick, Jason, and Julia were wearing bathing suits and carrying towels. Nestor gave them a disapproving glare. "And where exactly do you think you're going?" They stood frozen in place, not sure how to answer. Nestor couldn't keep a straight face. He broke into a smile. He threw his head back and he laughed. Then he turned back to his gardening. Julie was irritated. "That's it?" she said to Nestor. "You look at us and laugh? That's how you take care of us?" "What would you have me tell you?" Nestor asked. The old man picked up a small begonia and turned it carefully in his fingers as if it were a precious stone. "What should I say? Be careful on the stairs. Don't run. Don't trip. Don't drown. Don't get kidnapped. Don't. Nestor smiled happily. His eyes twinkled. "I say do. Do and have fun doing it." "I never met anybody like that before," murmured Julia, moving cautiously along the stairs that led down to the seaside. There was something about Nestor that made her slightly uncomfortable. The cliffside stairs looked treacherous. Supposedly they were built solidly, but one misstep and well, it was a long way to the bottom. The stairs consisted of flights of steps carved directly into the rock. These alternated with walkways of wood and metal, under which one could see the froth of the sea swirling around the rocks. At the top of the cliff, Julia felt a little bit dizzy from the height, and the sea below seemed unreal to her. And now it came into focus with each step. It grew louder and more dangerous. Julia was no longer sure that swimming was such a great idea. The children made their way slowly, holding on to the guide ropes with both hands. The wind whipped through their hair, bringing with it the smell of seaside and wet sand. As they climbed down farther, the steps became damper and more slippery from the sea spray. "I don't like that old guy," Rick said to Nestor. "No," he said, "I like that old guy." "I don't know," said Julia. "There's something about him I don't trust." Jason, half listening, gazing dreamily at the sea. He barely watched where he was going. Already he was in love with Kilmore Cove, with Argo Manor, and with his new life in this place. Unlike his sister Julia, Jason was glad to be away from the city, the noise, and the confusion. It was too much for him, but here at Argo Manor, in this world, he felt at home. Rick was the last one down, and he paused to look up along the ridges of the cliff. It was as though he was trying to see something that he couldn't quite explain. The truth was, Rick had an uneasy feeling that they were being watched. Once he even seemed to catch a glimpse of reflected light. And that reflection was enough for him to imagine that Nestor was keeping watch on them through a pair of binoculars. Maybe he was more concerned about their safety than he pretended. Or maybe he watched them for some unknown reason. At last the three reached an isolated cove, a stretch of beach nestled between two outcroppings of rocks. It was sheltered from the wind and from curious eyes. Argo Manor towered high over them, bathed in sunlight. The seagulls wheeled around their nest, built it into the crevices of the rock. Their throaty cries are ringing out. "Oh, it's beautiful," Julia said, admiring their graceful flight. "Rats with wings," Rick said scornfully. "They're scavengers and they will eat anything." Julia frowned. "That's what people in London said about pigeons, but I don't care. I like them." In this part of the cove, the water was calm, protected from the waves by the rocks. Julia dropped her towel on the sand and dove into the sea. The water was freezing but refreshing. She disappeared under the water, and like a seal, she came up to the surface 10 yards farther out. She swam with powerful strokes, her body powerful and strong. "Come on," she shouted. "It's fantastic." And she was right. The sandy floor of the inlet stretched out into the sea, remaining shallow for several yards. Along the row of rocks, the sea spray created tiny rainbows that danced in the sunlight. The sound of the waves was almost magical, enchanting, like a siren's call, hypnotic and alluring. Rick dived in and swam with effortless confidence. Julia couldn't help but admire his strength and grace in the water. Jason stayed on the shore, his arms crossed, water lapping at his feet. "Come on in, Jason," Julie urged. She confided to Rick. "He's always been like this. He's more of a watcher. He likes to be alone." Rick nodded. The droplets of water in Julia's hair were like little pearls, and he liked swimming with her and floating in the sea together. It was turning out to be an awesome day. From the top of the cliff, Nestor smiled. He could hear the kids' distant laughter and knew that the three of them had reached the beach safe and sound. It was good to hear young voices at the house. Maybe, just maybe, he was right. There was something special about those two and their friend. Maybe the old magic would come back to the house. He returned to the flowers, thrusting his hands into the dirt. He decided not to think about it or worry about it or even be fearful of it. Whatever would come, and come what may, he would be ready. Still, Nestor thought of Jason and Julia and Rick. It would be good to wake up in the morning and imagine a new day. Their questions, their curiosity, they were alive. They were open to new things, new adventures. And if they were really special, as gifted as he hoped they were, well, who knew? For now there was only the sound of their laughter carried by the wind. Laughter. That was something that had not been heard for a long time at Argo Manor. For a long, long time. Nothing better, murmured the old man. There's nothing better. He pressed his fingers down into the fresh earth, looking for the best spot for the small roots of his tender young flowers. Meanwhile, Jason, Julia, and Rick were lying stomach down on their towels, lining up some of the treasures they'd fished out of the sand. An assortment of colored rocks and shells and a piece of wood with an iron bolt attached to it. To get the wood, Rick had swum out all the way to the very edge of the rocks, where the sea got deeper and the current started to pull at him like a hand grabbing at his legs. Rick felt it was wiser not to go farther out, and Julia happily agreed with him. There was no sense risking their lives when they had everything they needed right here. Julia flipped onto her back to sunbathe while Rick and Jason explored the cove. They discovered a second stretch of beach, where there were traces of the small wooden pier. A number of mooring lines still hung from it. The walkways and boards had almost totally rotted away, but the remnants stood as evidence that old Ulysses had once, in fact, kept a boat there. Jason was daydreaming about the old man's adventures as he and Rick went back to tell the news to Julia, who was becoming thoroughly bored with sunbathing. That was typical of Julia. She could sit still for 15 minutes, tops. She sat up, hugged her knees as Jason told her about what he and Rick had found. His telling made their adventures on the rocks take on mystic proportions. While Jason spoke, Rick felt a raindrop on his face and he looked up. A dark cloud crossed overhead. Rain, he announced. Jason looked up the long series of steps that wound their way back up to the house. A long, hard climb. Should we start back up, he said. We better, Rick decided. It may only be a shower, but you never know. We should be very careful. Julia agreed. Anything was better than sitting around in the rain. The rain came harder now, and the steps were more slippery than ever. Jason struggled to keep up with his athletic sister and his new friend. In a burst of energy, he pushed them aside and sprinted up the stairs in twos and threes. He couldn't last at that pace, but at least he'd get a head start. See you at the top, suckers, he shouted, and Julia turned to Rick. Come on, let's race, she urged. But Rick surprised her. His face was calm and content. Let him go, Rick said. He gets to win while we take it nice and slow together. Suddenly, Jason screamed. Julia and Rick looked up just in time to see him tumbling and falling and clawing for his life along the cliff. Chapter 7, A Helping Hand. Jason's first thought, the one he immediately had, was when his left foot slipped, when he lost his balance, was this. That was really stupid of me. He slid down against the white rocks of the cliff. It felt like someone was rubbing a cheese grater against his chest. His hands clawed against the rocks and managed to cling to a crevice. That's how Jason thought of it, too. His hands took over while he kind of watched. It was all animal instinct and reaction. His hands found the rock. His body saved itself. Strangely, Jason wasn't panicked. Not in the least. Instead, he felt an eerie calm, a kind of slow motion replay that you see on football games, as if he were watching himself from a great distance, falling and falling. His hands held onto the edge of the rock, and they held tight. Jason was no longer falling. He was now dangling, hanging into the crevice in the rock with both hands. And still, for some reason, he was not afraid. Go figure. Of course, Julia and Rick were scared out of their minds. Hold on, Rick shouted. We'll help you. Julia's mind swirled with images and fractured thoughts, but no words came. She ran with Rick up the stairs to the exact point where Jason had fallen. He was just a few feet below them, but way out of reach. Rick's eyes darted about as he quickly assessed the scene, and he searched for something, anything that he might be of use. A stick, a loose piece of board, the towels. Yes, the towels. Maybe make them into some kind of a rope. And he looked down at Jason. Could you hold on long enough? Jason was not strong. There was not much time. Then he saw it. To Jason's right, not far at all, there was a small ledge, just a few inches down and over. Julia was growing increasingly frantic. Her eyes looked wild and her damp hair tangled in front of her face, and she was shaking. Stay calm, Rick told her. He grabbed Julia by the shoulders. Do you hear me? You want to save Jason. You need to stay calm and do exactly as I say. Julia's wild eyes slowly gained focus, and she looked at Rick and blinked, nodding. All right, she said. I'll stay calm. Meanwhile, Jason's arm muscles were beginning to burn. His fingers deadened and his grip began to slip. Jason glanced down, worried. Here, he shoved the 2 towels into Julia's hand. Tear it into strips like this, and Rick pulled at the towel, tearing it lengthwise. Then tie the ends together. Do you see? We'll make a rope. Guys, Jason said, sorry to bother you, but I'm slipping. Julia began tearing at the towel. Rick turned to Jason, and he knelt down, trying to get as close as possible. Listen to me, Jason, he said. There's a small ledge to your right. Do you see it? Jason nodded. Look down to your right. You can do this, Jason. Do you see the ledge? Jason turned his head, glancing down again, and he nodded sharply. Yes, he saw it. You're going to have to climb along the rock wall, he said, like a spider. First one hand, then the foot, then the other hand, then the other foot. Do you understand? Like a spider, Jason said. There he was, hanging from a crevice in the rock, 60 feet from the ground, and he felt clear-headed and in control. It was bizarre. It was as if the hand of fate had reached out to him and plucked him out to do this one thing, and there was no way that Jason could fail. He knew exactly what he had to do. Not that it would be easy. Jason felt blindly along the rock wall, his fingers seeking something to hold on to. His legs trembled from the strain, and Jason fought with everything he had. He endured every inch and every ache, and at last his feet found a secure ledge carved into the cliff. His arms loosened. Balance corrected. He could look up and stand. And finally reassured, Jason managed to look up, and he smiled. I'm all right, he said. Rick and Julia exchanged relieved glances. Rick was checking the knots, pulling on the ends of the rope towel. Good work, he said to Julia. Rick tied one end to the stair railing above Jason. The other end dangled down within Jason's reach. Grab hold, Rick said. We will pull you up. By now, Jason was filled with confidence. He was a spider. He could do whatever was necessary. He could climb safely, even without a rope. Jason felt it in his bones. All he had to do was slowly and carefully feel along the rock, and... What was that? His hand found a hole. No, an opening. Was it a nest of some kind? The home of a cliff-dwelling bird? Jason looked at it more closely. The opening was a perfect rectangle, carved by a man-made tool, and it was deep like the sleeve of a coat. Wait a minute, Jason called up. There's something here. Jason reached inside the opening and felt something soft in his hand. It was a fabric of some kind. Then, for a reason he could not explain, not then or ever, Jason sensed there was a cave behind the cliff. He didn't think it might be there. He knew it was there. He withdrew his hand and realized that he was holding something small and brick-shaped. It was wrapped in a cloth. Jason! Grab onto the rope, Rick cried. Please, Jason, Julia pleaded. Jason snapped out of his thoughts, and he stuffed the object into his swimming trunks, grabbed the rope with both hands, and began to climb with his legs. When Rick and Julia had helped pull him up to safety, all the strength seemed to drain right out of Jason's body, and he was exhausted. Julia threw her arms around him. Oh, are you okay? She asked in her twin in her hushed voice. He was, but he couldn't answer. He just smiled. He was relieved, and he was safe at last. The 3 friends stood in a tight clump, breathing hard. Finally, Jason pulled out the object he'd discovered. Look what I found, he said. Never mind that, Julia said crossly. You're scratched up all over and you're bleeding. We need to get you back to the house now. Jason blinked. Scratches? Bleeding? He looked at his chest, his arms, and his legs, and his skin was rubbed raw in places, scratched and bruised and bloodied. He suddenly felt just a little bit lightheaded. He looked down to where he'd climbed from. How did I do that? He wondered aloud. What happened? Not now, Rick said, pulling Jason to his feet. Don't talk. Here, hold on to me, one step at a time, up these stairs, nice and slow. Together, the three friends made their way up the stairs. Jason still gripped the object tightly.